The carriage wheels ground against the packed snow with a sound like breaking bones. Dr. Matthias Blackwood pulled his wool coat tighter as the vehicle lurched through another deep rut, the winter landscape of northern Vermont stretching endlessly white in every direction. Through the frost-covered window, he could see the Ashford estate emerging from the gloom like something carved from the storm clouds themselves, all Gothic towers and black stone, its windows glowing amber against the approaching darkness. "Nearly there now, sir," the driver called back, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the bare branches of the surrounding forest. Dr. Blackwood nodded, though the man couldn't see him, and checked his pocket watch. 6:30. He had been traveling since dawn, summoned by a telegram so urgent and cryptic that he had cancelled 3 appointments and left Boston immediately. The message had been brief: "Come at once. Patient requires immediate consultation. Most unusual case. Payment triple your standard fee. Ashford Estate, Millbrook, Vermont." It was signed simply, H. Ashford, and something in the stark desperation of those few words had compelled Dr. Blackwood to pack his medical bag and board the first available train north. As one of Boston's most respected alienists, he had treated every manner of mental disorder: hysteria in young women, melancholia in veterans of the recent war, the violent outbursts of those whose minds had been shattered by trauma or disease. But in 12 years of practice, he had never received a summons quite like this one. The carriage pulled to a stop before the mansion's imposing front entrance, where 2 stone gargoyles perched like silent sentinels above the heavy oak doors. Dr. Blackwood gathered his belongings and stepped down into the snow, which crunched under his leather boots with that same bone-breaking sound. The cold bit at his face immediately, and he hurried up the stone steps to the shelter of the covered portico. Before he could raise his hand to knock, the door swung open to reveal a tall, gaunt man in his 50s, dressed in formal evening wear despite the early hour. The man's face was pale and drawn, with deep lines etched around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "Dr. Blackwood, I presume," the man said, extending a trembling hand. "I am Harold Ashford. Thank you for coming so quickly. Please, come in from the cold." Dr. Blackwood shook the offered hand, noting how clammy and cold the man's palm felt even through his gloves. "Mr. Ashford, your telegram was quite urgent. I trust the patient's condition is stable." Ashford's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Stable? Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe it. Please, follow me. My wife is waiting in the parlor, and then we'll take you to see Caroline." The interior of the mansion was as imposing as its exterior, all dark wood paneling and heavy velvet drapes, with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors staring down from ornate frames. Gas lamps flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The air smelled of old books and something else, something medicinal and sharp that Dr. Blackwood couldn't quite identify. They entered a richly appointed parlor where a woman sat perched on the edge of a burgundy settee, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her pale skin. She was younger than her husband, perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. When she looked up at Dr. Blackwood's entrance, he was struck by the haunted quality of her dark eyes. "Doctor, this is my wife, Constance," Harold said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Constance, Dr. Blackwood has come about Caroline." Mrs. Ashford rose quickly, smoothing her dark blue dress with nervous gestures. "Dr. Blackwood, thank heaven you're here. We've been at our wits' end. Caroline has been with us for 3 months now, and her condition, well, it defies explanation." "Please, sit," Dr. Blackwood said, settling into a leather armchair across from the couple. He withdrew a small notebook from his jacket pocket and opened it to a fresh page. "Tell me about the patient. Age, background, presenting symptoms." The Ashfords exchanged a look that Dr. Blackwood had seen countless times in his practice, the desperate glance between family members who had reached the end of their resources and weren't sure how much truth they could safely reveal. Harold cleared his throat. Caroline is 14 years old. We took her in after a terrible incident at the Danvers State Hospital. There was a fire, you see, and many of the patient records were destroyed. Caroline was found in the ruins, physically unharmed but changed. Changed how? Dr. Blackwood asked, his pen poised over the paper. She speaks differently now, Constance said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Not like a child at all. She uses medical terms, describes her own symptoms with a precision that would be remarkable in a trained physician. And she knows things she couldn't possibly know. What sort of things? Harold stood abruptly and began pacing to the window, where he stared out at the darkening sky. She knew your name before we told her we had contacted you. She described your appearance, your manner of dress, even the contents of your medical bag. And yesterday, she told us exactly what time your carriage would arrive, down to the minute. Dr. Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Vermont winter. In his years of practice, he had encountered patients who claimed prophetic abilities. Invariably, they were suffering from elaborate delusions brought on by hysteria or nervous exhaustion. But something in the Ashford's manner suggested this case might be different. I should like to examine the patient now, he said, closing his notebook and rising from his chair. Of course, Constance said, though she made no move to leave her seat. But doctor, before you meet her, you should know. Caroline has been asking for you. By name. For 3 days now, she's been saying that Dr. Blackwood would arrive this evening, and that he would have questions she's been waiting to answer. They led him up a grand staircase and down a long hallway lined with more ancestral portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress. At the end of the corridor, Harold stopped before a heavy wooden door and turned to face Dr. Blackwood. Doctor, I must warn you. Caroline is unsettling. There's something about her that makes one feel exposed, as if she can see directly into your thoughts. My wife and I have found it increasingly difficult to be in her presence for extended periods. Before Dr. Blackwood could respond, a voice came from behind the door, clear, articulate, and unmistakably that of a young woman. You may come in now, Dr. Blackwood. I've been waiting for you. Harold's face went white. We didn't tell her you had arrived, he whispered. Dr. Blackwood straightened his shoulders and reached for the door handle. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Ashford. I believe I can handle whatever Miss Caroline might present. The door opened into a spacious bedroom decorated in pale blues and whites, with tall windows that looked out over the snow-covered grounds. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting warm light across the Persian rug and antique furniture. In a chair by the window sat a girl who appeared to be exactly what the Ashfords had described, 14 years old, with long auburn hair and pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the firelight. But it was her eyes that stopped Dr. Blackwood cold. They were the deepest green he had ever seen, and they held an intelligence and awareness that belonged to someone far older than 14. When she looked at him, he felt as if she were cataloguing not just his appearance but his thoughts, his fears, his very soul. Good evening, Dr. Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying none of the breathless quality he expected from a young patient. Please, sit down. We have a great deal to discuss, and I'm afraid your time here will be more limited than you expect. Dr. Blackwood moved to a chair across from her, noting with clinical interest that she sat with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap, showing none of the fidgeting or nervous energy typical of adolescence in medical situations. Caroline, I presume, he said, settling into his seat and opening his notebook again. I'm here to help determine the nature of your condition and see what treatment might be beneficial. She smiled then, and the expression was somehow both childlike and ancient. My condition, doctor, is that I am perfectly aware of what's happening to me, which makes me perhaps the most unusual patient you've ever encountered. Most people who experience what I'm experiencing lose their sanity within weeks. I, however, seem to be getting clearer every day. And what exactly are you experiencing? I can feel my brain changing, she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. The neural pathways are restructuring themselves, forming new connections that shouldn't be possible. The hippocampus is particularly active, that's the region responsible for memory formation, as I'm sure you know. But the memories being formed aren't entirely my own. Dr. Blackwood's pen had stopped moving across the page. No 14-year-old should possess such detailed knowledge of neuroanatomy, certainly not a patient rescued from an asylum. Caroline, where did you learn these medical terms? That's the fascinating question, isn't it? She replied, leaning forward slightly. I remember learning them, but I also remember things that happened before I was born. I remember surgical procedures I've never witnessed, conversations I've never heard, people I've never met. Yesterday, I remembered your lecture at Harvard Medical School from 1867 on the treatment of hysteria in young women. You spoke about the importance of understanding the patient's internal experience rather than simply cataloging external symptoms. You wore a gray suit and spilled coffee on your notes just before beginning. The notebook slipped from Dr. Blackwood's fingers and fell to the floor. He had indeed given such a lecture, and he had spilled coffee on his notes. But the lecture had been given to a small group of colleagues and medical students. There was no way a 14-year-old girl could have been present, much less remember such specific details 5 years later. How could you possibly know that? He whispered. Caroline's smile widened, and in that moment, Dr. Blackwood noticed something that made his blood turn cold. Her pupils didn't respond to the changing light from the fireplace the way human pupils should. Instead, they seemed to reflect the light back, like mirrors. That's the wrong question, doctor, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than if she had shouted. You're wondering if I'm real, aren't you? The question you should be asking is whether you are. Have you ever met someone who seemed to know more about you than you knew about yourself? Dr. Blackwood spent a restless night in the guest quarters, his mind churning over Caroline's impossible knowledge and those unsettling mirror-like eyes. When morning came, pale winter light filtering through frost-covered windows, he found himself both dreading and anticipating his formal examination of the girl. He had dealt with elaborate delusions before, patients who constructed intricate false memories or claimed supernatural abilities, but something about Caroline felt fundamentally different. After a brief breakfast with the Ashfords, during which Harold's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup, Dr. Blackwood gathered his medical instruments and returned to Caroline's room. She was waiting for him in the same chair by the window, dressed in a simple white dress that made her pale skin appear almost luminous. "Good morning, doctor," she said without looking up from the book in her lap. "I trust you slept poorly." The mind always struggles to process information that contradicts its fundamental assumptions about reality. Dr. Blackwood set his medical bag on a nearby table and began removing his instruments, stethoscope, ophthalmoscope, reflex hammer, and various other tools of his trade. "Indeed. Shall we begin with a standard physical examination?" "By all means," Caroline said, closing her book and setting it aside. As she did, Dr. Blackwood caught a glimpse of the title, Principles of Physiological Psychology, by Wilhelm Wundt. It was a recent publication, highly technical, and certainly not appropriate reading material for a 14-year-old girl. "Where did you acquire that book?" he asked. "I've always had it," she replied simply. "Just as I've always known about the small scar on your left wrist from a dissection accident during your second year of medical school. You were examining a cadaver's nervous system when your scalpel slipped." Dr. Blackwood's hand moved involuntarily to his left wrist, where indeed a thin white scar marked the spot where he had cut himself during a particularly challenging anatomy lesson. The accident had been witnessed by only his instructor and one other student, both of whom had sworn to secrecy to protect his reputation. Caroline, I need you to understand that what you're describing is impossible. There is no way you could know such specific details about my past. She tilted her head, studying him with those unsettling green eyes. Impossible according to what we currently understand about the human brain, yes. But our understanding is remarkably limited, don't you think? We know so little about consciousness, about memory, about the ways in which information can be transmitted from one mind to another. Dr. Blackwood approached her chair, his stethoscope in hand. May I listen to your heart? Of course. Though I should warn you, what you hear may not match what you expect. He placed the stethoscope against her chest, positioning it carefully over her heart. For a moment, he heard the normal lube-dub rhythm he expected, but then something changed. The heartbeats seemed to multiply, as if he were listening to several hearts beating in slightly different rhythms, creating a complex polyrhythmic pattern that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. How many hearts do you hear, doctor? Caroline asked quietly. That's not possible, he whispered, moving the stethoscope to different positions on her chest. No matter where he placed it, he heard the same multiple rhythms, as if her single heart were somehow beating for several people at once. 5, she said matter-of-factly. You're hearing 5 different cardiac rhythms. They belong to Mary Hutchins, Sarah Wickham, Elizabeth Crane, Margaret Foster, and myself. Though I'm beginning to suspect that myself is a more complicated concept than I initially understood. Dr. Blackwood stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he lowered the stethoscope. Caroline, you're speaking about these people as if they're part of me. They are, doctor. Their memories, their experiences, their very essence, it's all here, layered within my consciousness like geological strata. When I close my eyes, I can see through Mary's eyes as she walked through a garden in springtime. I can feel Sarah's terror during her final moments. I can recall Elizabeth's first kiss with a clarity that makes me blush, even though I've never been kissed myself. That's impossible. Memory doesn't work that way. Caroline smiled, and for a moment her expression seemed to shift, as if different personalities were flickering across her features like shadows cast by a fire. Memory works exactly that way, doctor. We simply haven't discovered how to access it properly. But someone did discover it. Someone learned how to extract memories from one brain and implant them in another. Someone turned me into a living repository of stolen experiences. Dr. Blackwood sat down heavily in his chair, his medical training warring with the evidence of his own senses. You're suggesting that some form of surgical procedure was performed to transfer memories between patients? I'm not suggesting anything, doctor. I'm telling you exactly what happened. Would you like me to describe the procedure? I remember it quite clearly, from 5 different perspectives. Before he could respond, she began speaking in a voice that had suddenly become clinical and detached, as if she were reading from a medical textbook. The procedure begins with careful exposure of the temporal lobe, specifically targeting the hippocampus and surrounding structures. A series of delicate incisions allows access to the neural tissue, where microscopic instruments can be used to extract cellular material containing encoded memories. This material is then prepared using a process involving electrical stimulation and chemical preservation before being implanted into the corresponding structures of the recipient brain. Dr. Blackwood felt his mouth go dry. The level of detail she was describing was far beyond anything in current medical literature, yet it had a horrifying plausibility that made his skin crawl. Caroline, where did you learn this? I didn't learn it, doctor. I lived it. I was conscious during my own procedure, just as Mary was conscious during hers, and Sarah during hers. We all felt the surgeon's instruments moving through our minds, felt our memories being carved away like pieces of fruit, felt the foreign thoughts being pressed into our brains like seeds in fertile soil. She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression of profound sadness. The worst part isn't the memories themselves, Doctor. It's the gaps they left behind. I can remember Mary's childhood home in perfect detail, but I can't remember my own. I know exactly what Sarah's mother looked like, but I have no idea if my own mother is still alive. I am a collection of fragments from other people's lives, held together by surgical thread and the desperate hope that somehow, someday, I might become whole again. Dr. Blackwood approached the window and stood beside her, noting how the winter light seemed to pass through her skin as if she were made of porcelain. Caroline, I want to help you. But I need to understand what was done to you, and by whom. Dr. Silas Crowell, she said without hesitation. He believed that consciousness was simply a pattern of electrical activity, and that patterns could be copied, transferred, combined. He wanted to create the perfect patient, someone who understood their own condition so completely that they could assist in their own treatment. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and created something far more terrible than he intended. Where is Dr. Crowell now? Caroline turned to face him, and in that moment Dr. Blackwood saw something in her eyes that made his blood freeze. It was recognition, but not the recognition of a patient looking at her doctor. It was the recognition of one colleague greeting another. He's here, doctor, she said in a voice that was suddenly deeper, more masculine. He's been here all along, watching through my eyes, thinking through my brain, waiting for someone skilled enough to understand his work. And now that you're here, Matthias, we can finally complete what we started. Dr. Blackwood staggered backward, his hand reaching instinctively for the door handle. You're not Caroline. I'm Caroline, and Mary, and Sarah, and Elizabeth, and Margaret, she said, her voice shifting between different tones and inflections with each name. And I'm also Silas Crowell, the man who created me. The man who put part of himself into each of his subjects to ensure that his work would survive even if his body didn't. That's medically impossible. Is it? She asked, moving closer to him with predatory grace. You felt my heart beating with 5 different rhythms. You heard me describe surgical procedures that haven't been invented yet. You saw the light reflecting from my pupils like mirrors because they're not quite human anymore. Tell me, doctor, what part of this seems possible to your rational mind? Dr. Blackwood's hand found the door handle, but before he could turn it, Caroline spoke again, and her voice was now unmistakably that of an older man, cultured and precise. Don't leave yet, Matthias. I have so much to show you. So much to teach you. You see, the human brain is far more malleable than we ever imagined. Memory, personality, consciousness itself, these are just patterns of electrical activity, and patterns can be rewritten. I've proven it with Caroline, and with the others before her. And now, with your help, I can prove it again. You're insane, Dr. Blackwood whispered. Am I? Or am I simply the first person to understand what consciousness really is? Caroline's eyes had gone completely black now, the pupils dilated so wide that no iris remained visible. Look at me, Matthias. Really look at me. What do you see? Despite every instinct screaming at him to flee, Dr. Blackwood found himself staring into those black, mirror-like eyes. And in their depths, he saw something that made his sanity begin to crack at the edges. He saw faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all staring back at him with expressions of desperate hunger. They were the faces of patients, of doctors, of nurses and orderlies and visitors who had come to the hospital and never left, not really. They were all there, trapped in the black mirrors of Caroline's eyes, their consciousness harvested and stored like specimens in jars. Now you're beginning to understand, Caroline said, and her voice was a chorus now, dozens of different voices speaking in perfect unison. We are not one. We are many. And soon, doctor, you will be part of us too. Dr. Blackwood yanked open the door and stumbled into the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, he could hear Caroline laughing, but it wasn't the laugh of a 14-year-old girl. It was the sound of many voices laughing at once, creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. As he ran down the corridor toward the main staircase, one thought echoed in his mind with crystalline clarity: whatever Caroline Wells had become, she was no longer human. And if Dr. Crowell was truly alive within her consciousness, then the horrors he had witnessed were just the beginning. The next morning brought no relief from the previous day's revelations. Dr. Blackwood had barely slept, his dreams filled with mirror-like eyes and the sound of multiple heartbeats echoing in impossible harmony. Over breakfast, the Ashfords seemed to avoid his gaze, their nervous energy more pronounced than ever. "I must travel to Danvers," Dr. Blackwood announced, setting down his coffee cup with a decisive clink. "I need to examine the hospital records, speak with the staff who were present during the alleged fire." Harold Ashford's fork clattered against his plate. "Doctor, I'm not sure that's wise. The hospital administration has been uncooperative regarding inquiries about Caroline. Nevertheless, I cannot provide proper treatment without understanding the full scope of what was done to her." Dr. Blackwood stood, his medical bag already packed and waiting by the door. "I'll return this evening. Please ensure that Caroline remains under observation in my absence." The journey to Danvers State Hospital took most of the morning, the hired carriage rolling through the bleak Massachusetts countryside under a sky the color of old pewter. As they approached the institution, Dr. Blackwood was struck by how normal it appeared from the outside, a collection of brick buildings arranged around courtyards, with none of the Gothic menace of the Ashford estate. If anything, it looked peaceful, almost pastoral. But as his carriage passed through the main gates, he noticed something odd. There were no signs of fire damage anywhere visible. No blackened walls, no boarded windows, no evidence of the catastrophic blaze that had allegedly destroyed patient records and left Caroline as the sole survivor. The hospital administrator, a thin, nervous man named Edmund Cordwainer, met Dr. Blackwood in the main lobby. His handshake was weak and clammy, his eyes darting constantly toward the corridors that led deeper into the building. "Dr. Blackwood, yes, I received your telegram," Cordwainer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I must say, this is highly irregular. We don't typically allow outside physicians access to our facilities without proper authorization. I'm investigating the case of Caroline Wells, a patient who was supposedly found in the ruins after a fire destroyed your records," Dr. Blackwood replied, studying the man's reaction carefully. "I assume you remember the incident?" Cordwainer's face went pale, and he glanced around the lobby as if checking to see who might be listening. "Doctor, perhaps we should discuss this in my office. Away from the patients." They walked through corridors lined with heavy doors, each bearing a small window that revealed glimpses of the residents within. Some paced restlessly in their cells, others sat motionless on narrow beds, and a few pressed their faces against the glass, watching Dr. Blackwood pass with expressions of desperate hope. The air smelled of carbolic acid and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded him uncomfortably of the scent that had clung to Caroline's room. Cordwainer's office was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and stacks of paper that seemed to teeter precariously on every available surface. The administrator closed the door carefully behind them and gestured for Dr. Blackwood to take a seat in a worn leather chair. "Doctor, I must ask for your complete discretion in what I'm about to tell you," Cordwainer began, settling behind his desk with obvious reluctance. "The truth is, there was no fire at Danvers. At least, not the kind of fire you're thinking of. I beg your pardon. The records weren't destroyed by accident, Doctor. They were destroyed deliberately, burned in the basement furnace by direct order of the hospital's board of directors. We were instructed to remove all evidence of certain activities that had been taking place here." Dr. Blackwood leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What sort of activities?" Cordwainer's hands trembled as he opened a desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder that had been hidden beneath a stack of routine correspondence. Dr. Silas Crowell was conducting unauthorized experiments on female patients between the ages of 12 and 16. We didn't know the full extent of his work until after he was found dead in his laboratory. How did he die? Suicide, officially. He was discovered in his private surgical suite with his wrists cut, surrounded by what appeared to be failed experimental apparatus. But Dr. Cordwainer paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. The amount of blood in that room was impossible. Far more than one human body could contain. Dr. Blackwood felt a chill creep up his spine. Show me his laboratory. I can't. It was sealed by order of the State Medical Board. But doctor, before we go any further, you should know that 5 young women died in that room. Their bodies were found in various stages of modification. Surgical alterations to the brain that defied medical explanation. And Caroline? Caroline Wells was never a patient here, Cordwainer said, his voice now shaking with barely controlled fear. According to our records, no one by that name was ever admitted to this institution. Yet we found her in Dr. Crowell's laboratory, alive and apparently unharmed, sitting calmly beside his corpse as if she were waiting for someone to discover her. The folder in Cordwainer's hands contained a collection of documents that made Dr. Blackwood's blood run cold. Patient intake forms for 5 young women, all bearing different names but sharing certain similarities, age, physical characteristics, and most disturbing of all, notes indicating they had all been selected for special treatment by Dr. Crowell. Mary Hutchins, age 16, admitted for hysteria following the death of her parents. Sarah Wickham, age 14, committed by her family for unnatural behavior. Elizabeth Crane, age 15, brought in after claiming to hear voices that predicted future events. Margaret Foster, age 13, institutionalized for violent episodes that her family couldn't control. And at the bottom of the stack, a document that shouldn't have existed, an intake form for Caroline Wells, age 14, with a notation in Dr. Crowell's handwriting, subject shows unusual resilience to previous procedures. Ideal candidate for final integration. This suggests that Caroline was indeed a patient here, Dr. Blackwood said, holding up the document. Cordwainer shook his head vigorously. That form was found in Dr. Crowell's personal effects after his death, but there's no corresponding admission record in our official files. It's as if he created it in anticipation of a patient who never arrived. Or perhaps. He paused, his face growing even paler. Perhaps Caroline Wells is what became of the other 5 girls after Dr. Crowell finished his work. That's impossible. One person cannot be composed of multiple individuals. Is it impossible, doctor? Or is it simply beyond our current understanding of what the human mind is capable of? Cordwainer stood and moved to the window, staring out at the hospital grounds with haunted eyes. I've been the administrator here for 15 years. I've seen patients with conditions that challenged everything I thought I knew about medicine and psychology. But nothing prepared me for what Dr. Crowell was doing in that laboratory. I need to see it. Doctor, I told you, it's been sealed. Then unseal it. I am conducting a legitimate medical investigation, and I have the authority to examine any facilities relevant to my patient's case. Cordwainer was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a heavy iron key. Very well. But doctor, whatever you see in that room, please remember that the official cause of those girls' deaths was listed as complications from their existing mental conditions. The board was very specific about that. They descended into the basement of the hospital, past the laundry rooms and storage areas, to a corridor that seemed older and more oppressive than the rest of the building. Gas lamps flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy oak door bearing a brass nameplate, Drive S. Crowell, Private Laboratory. Cordwainer inserted the key with visibly shaking hands and turned the lock. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the basement corridor like a death rattle. The laboratory beyond was a chamber of horrors that defied Dr. Blackwood's worst imaginings. Surgical tables stood in precise rows, their surfaces stained with substances that had long since dried to the color of rust. Shelves lined the walls, bearing glass jars filled with floating specimens that he didn't want to examine too closely. But it was the walls themselves that drew his attention. They were covered from floor to ceiling with detailed anatomical drawings of human brains, each one meticulously labeled with dates, patient names, and notes written in Dr. Crowell's precise handwriting. "Dear God," Dr. Blackwood whispered, stepping deeper into the room. The drawings showed cross-sections of brains in various stages of what could only be described as modification. Neural pathways had been traced in red ink, with notes indicating which sections had been harvested, and which had been implanted. Most disturbing of all, every single drawing was labeled with the name, Caroline Wells, and dated years before she had supposedly been found in this very room. "Doctor, look at this," Cordwainer called from the far corner of the laboratory. Dr. Blackwood turned to see the administrator standing beside a large cabinet filled with leather-bound journals. The books were arranged chronologically, spanning a period of nearly 5 years, and each one bore Dr. Crowell's name on the spine. "These are his research notes," Cordwainer explained, carefully removing one of the journals. "The board ordered them destroyed along with everything else, but I couldn't bring myself to burn them. The scientific implications were too significant." Dr. Blackwood opened the journal and began reading Dr. Crowell's meticulous handwriting. What he found there was both brilliant and utterly horrifying, detailed accounts of surgical procedures designed to extract memories from one brain and implant them into another. The early entries described failed attempts, patients who died during the procedures or survived but remained in vegetative states. But as the months progressed, Dr. Crowell's techniques became more sophisticated, his success rate improved. And through it all, one name appeared with increasing frequency: Caroline Wells. Not as a patient, but as a project. Dr. Crowell had been designing her from the beginning, planning to create a single individual who would contain the memories, experiences, and consciousness of multiple people. "Listen to this," Dr. Blackwood said, reading aloud from one of the later entries. "The subject designated Caroline Wells will serve as the ultimate repository for all successful memory transfers. Her brain structure shows unique adaptability to foreign neural patterns, making her the ideal candidate for comprehensive integration. When the process is complete, she will possess the combined knowledge and experiences of all previous subjects, creating a form of consciousness that transcends individual human limitations." "It's madness," Cordwainer whispered. "It's genius," Dr. Blackwood replied, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and unwilling admiration. "Twisted, evil genius, but genius nonetheless." Dr. Crowell wasn't just transferring memories, he was attempting to create a new form of human consciousness, one that could accumulate and preserve the experiences of multiple individuals. He continued reading, his hands growing steadier as his scientific mind began to grasp the full scope of what had been attempted. According to these notes, the final procedure was performed on Caroline Wells using neural material extracted from all 5 previous subjects. The process was designed to integrate their memories so completely that she would experience them as her own, creating a composite personality with access to multiple lifetimes of experience. "But Dr." Cordwainer said, his voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere of the laboratory, "if Dr. Crowell succeeded in creating such a being, what exactly is Caroline Wells now? Is she human? Is she something else entirely?" Before Dr. Blackwood could answer, a voice spoke from the shadows near the laboratory entrance, a voice he recognized with a mixture of dread and fascination. "I am what I have always been, Doctor," Caroline said, stepping into the flickering gaslight. "I am the sum of human experience, concentrated into a single consciousness. I am memory given form, knowledge made flesh. And I am very disappointed that you chose to investigate my origins without inviting me along. She was wearing a simple traveling dress and coat, her auburn hair pinned back in a style that made her appear older than her 14 years. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, those mirror-like pupils that seemed to reflect not just light, but the very souls of everyone who looked into them. How did you get here? Dr. Blackwood demanded, though part of him already knew the answer. I've been here all along, in a sense, Caroline replied, moving deeper into the laboratory with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the space. This is where I was born, after all. Where Dr. Crowell gave me life by taking it from others. Where I learned what it truly means to be human by experiencing humanity from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She approached one of the surgical tables and ran her fingers along its stained surface with something approaching affection. Mary Hutchins died on this table, but she lived on in me. Sarah Wickham's heart stopped beating here, but I carry the rhythm of her pulse in my chest. They are all part of me now, Doctor, just as Dr. Crowell intended. Caroline, you need help, Dr. Blackwood said, taking a step toward her. What was done to you was unconscionable, but it can be treated. Reversed, perhaps. She laughed, and the sound echoed through the laboratory like music played on broken instruments. Reversed? Doctor, you still don't understand what I am. I am not a patient to be cured. I am an evolution of human consciousness, the next step in the development of our species. Dr. Crowell may have created me through monstrous means, but the result transcends his original intentions. You're speaking of yourself as if you're not human. Am I human, Doctor? Caroline asked, tilting her head in a gesture that was both childlike and predatory. I have the memories of 6 different people, the accumulated knowledge of medical procedures I've never performed, the emotional experiences of lives I've never lived. I can feel Mary's first kiss and Sarah's final breath with equal clarity. I remember Dr. Crowell's thoughts as if they were my own, because in many ways, they are. She moved to the cabinet containing Dr. Crowell's journals and selected one from near the end of the collection. Would you like to know what his final entry says, Doctor? The one he wrote just before he died. Before Dr. Blackwood could respond, she began reading in a voice that gradually shifted from her own to that of an older man. The Caroline Wells project has exceeded all expectations. The subject has not only successfully integrated the neural patterns of all previous subjects but has begun to demonstrate emergent properties that suggest a form of consciousness previously unknown to medical science. She is no longer merely the sum of her component parts, she has become something entirely new. Something that may represent the future of human evolution. I find myself simultaneously proud of this achievement and terrified by its implications. What have I created? What have I unleashed upon the world? Caroline closed the journal and looked directly at Dr. Blackwood with those unsettling mirror-like eyes. He created me, Doctor. And now it's time for me to continue his work. The carriage ride back to the Ashford estate passed in oppressive silence. Caroline sat across from Dr. Blackwood, her hands folded calmly in her lap, occasionally glancing out at the winter landscape with an expression of serene contentment that was far more disturbing than any display of madness would have been. Dr. Blackwood found himself stealing glances at her reflection in the window glass, noting how the image seemed somehow incomplete, as if parts of her were missing from the reflection. When they arrived at the mansion, Harold and Constance Ashford were waiting in the parlor, their faces bearing the haggard look of people who had spent the day dreading the inevitable. They rose as Dr. Blackwood and Caroline entered, their movements stiff with barely controlled anxiety. Doctor, Harold began, his voice tight with strain, we trust your investigation was illuminating. Indeed it was, Dr. Blackwood replied, settling into his customary chair while Caroline took her place by the window. Though I suspect you already know what I discovered at Danvers. The look that passed between the Ashfords confirmed his suspicions. These were not simply concerned guardians who had taken in an orphan girl, they were co-conspirators in whatever Dr. Crowell had accomplished in his basement laboratory. Perhaps, Dr. Blackwood continued, his voice gaining authority as his medical training reasserted itself, it's time you told me the truth about your relationship with Caroline. And with Dr. Silas Crowell. Constance Ashford sank back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. We were colleagues, she whispered. Harold and I both worked with Dr. Crowell at Massachusetts General Hospital before he was dismissed for conducting unauthorized research. What sort of research? Harold moved to the fireplace and stared into the flames, his back rigid with tension. Silas was obsessed with the nature of consciousness, with the possibility of transferring knowledge and experience from one individual to another. He believed that the human mind was simply a complex pattern of electrical activity, and that patterns could be copied, modified, combined. The medical establishment rejected his theories, Constance added, her hands twisted together in her lap. They called his work dangerous, unethical. He was stripped of his license and forbidden from practicing medicine in Massachusetts. So he went to Danvers, Dr. Blackwood said, beginning to understand the scope of the conspiracy. We helped him secure the position, Harold admitted, still facing the fire. The state hospital was desperate for physicians, and they didn't investigate his background as thoroughly as they should have. We thought if he could prove his theories in a controlled environment, the medical community would eventually recognize the brilliance of his work. Caroline spoke for the first time since they had entered the parlor, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. They didn't simply help him secure the position, Doctor. They were active participants in his research. Harold served as his surgical assistant for many of the procedures, while Constance helped select appropriate subjects from among the patient population. The confession hit Dr. Blackwood like a physical blow. You participated in the murder of 5 young women. They weren't murdered, Constance said quickly, her voice rising with defensive panic. They were already patients at the hospital. Their families had committed them because they couldn't be helped through conventional treatment. Silas offered them a chance to contribute to medical science, to make their suffering meaningful. By having their brains dissected and their memories stolen. By becoming part of something greater than themselves, Harold said, turning from the fireplace with eyes that gleamed with fanatical conviction. Doctor, you've examined Caroline. You've seen what she's capable of. She possesses knowledge and abilities that no single human being should be able to demonstrate. She is proof that consciousness can transcend the limitations of individual existence. Dr. Blackwood looked at Caroline, who was watching the exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Is this true? Were you a willing participant in Dr. Crowell's procedures? Willing is a complex concept when applied to someone who didn't exist before those procedures created her, Caroline replied thoughtfully. The consciousness you're speaking to now was born on Dr. Crowell's surgical table, assembled from fragments of other minds like a mosaic made from broken glass. I have Mary Hutchins' memories of agreeing to the procedure, Sarah Wickham's terror as she realized what was happening, Elizabeth Crane's desperate hope that she might be cured. I contain multitudes, Doctor, and not all of them consented to what was done. Then you understand that what happened to you was wrong. Caroline's laugh was like silver bells ringing in a charnel house. Wrong? Doctor, what happened to me was the greatest medical breakthrough in human history. I am living proof that death is not the end of consciousness, that human experience can be preserved and combined in ways that create something entirely new. The methods may have been questionable, but the results speak for themselves. Dr. Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The results are an abomination. You are the product of murder and surgical mutilation, a patchwork of stolen minds sewn together by a madman's ambition. Am I? Caroline asked, rising from her own chair with fluid grace. Or am I evolution in action? Consider, Doctor, what makes you human? Is it your body, which replaces every cell over the course of 7 years? Is it your memories, which fade and change with each recollection? Or is it something deeper, some essential pattern that defines who you are? She moved closer to him, her mirror-like eyes reflecting his own disturbed expression back at him. I remember being born as Mary Hutchins in a farmhouse outside Worcester. I remember my first day of school, my first heartbreak, the night my parents died in a carriage accident. But I also remember being born as Sarah Wickham in a tenement in Boston's North End. I remember her hunger, her fear, her dreams of becoming a teacher. These memories aren't copies or echoes, they are as real and immediate as your own recollections of your childhood. Multiple memories don't make you multiple people. Don't they? Caroline tilted her head, and for a moment her features seemed to shift, as if different faces were superimposing themselves over her own. When I speak with Mary's voice, using her patterns of speech and her emotional responses, am I pretending to be her or am I being her? When I feel Sarah's grief for her lost family, is that Caroline Wells experiencing borrowed emotion, or is it Sarah Wickham continuing to exist within a shared consciousness? Dr. Blackwood found himself backing toward the door, his rational mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Caroline's face was definitely changing, cycling through different expressions and features as if she were wearing a series of invisible masks. The truth is, Doctor, Caroline continued, and now her voice was definitely that of an older man, Dr. Crowell himself, speaking through her lips, the individual consciousness you think of as Caroline Wells is simply the organizing principle that allows all these separate minds to coexist. She is the conductor of an orchestra composed of stolen souls, and I am the composer who wrote the music they play. Crowell, Dr. Blackwood whispered. You're still alive in her mind. Alive, dead, these distinctions become meaningless when consciousness can be transferred from one vessel to another, the voice replied. I preserved a portion of my own awareness within each of my subjects, ensuring that my work would continue even if my physical body failed. Caroline is my masterpiece, but she is also my resurrection. Harold Ashford stepped forward, his face shining with religious fervor. You see, Doctor. Silas achieved what no human being has ever achieved before. He conquered death itself, found a way to make consciousness immortal. Caroline is proof that the human spirit can transcend the limitations of flesh. She's proof that some boundaries should never be crossed, Dr. Blackwood said, his hand finding the door handle behind him. What you've created is not immortality, it's an imprisonment of souls. Caroline's features settled back into their familiar arrangement, though her eyes remained those impossible mirrors that seemed to reflect more than they should be able to see. Imprisonment? Doctor, I prefer to think of it as community. Mary and Sarah and Elizabeth and Margaret, they're not trapped within me. They live on through me. Their experiences, their emotions, their very essence continues to exist in a form more permanent than any gravestone or monument. And what of your own essence, Caroline? What happened to the girl you were before Dr. Crowell's procedures? For the first time since he had met her, Caroline's composed expression faltered. A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or loss, crossed her features before the mask of serene confidence reasserted itself. That, she said quietly, is the question I've been trying to answer since I became aware of what I am. The truth is, Doctor, I don't know if there ever was a Caroline Wells before the procedures. Dr. Crowell's notes suggest that I was designed from the beginning to be a vessel for other consciousnesses. Perhaps what you think of as my original personality is simply another construct, another fragment created to serve as the foundation for everything else. The admission hung in the air like a funeral shroud, and Dr. Blackwood felt a surge of unexpected sympathy for the creature standing before him. Whatever Caroline had become, she was as much a victim of Dr. Crowell's ambitions as the 5 young women whose memories she carried. Caroline, he said gently, regardless of how you came to be, you deserve better than this existence. You deserve the chance to discover who you truly are, separate from the consciousnesses that have been forced into your mind. Do I? She asked, and for a moment she sounded like nothing more than a confused 14-year-old girl. "Doctor, I've lived in this condition for months now. I've felt Mary's joy when she fell in love, Sarah's terror when she realized she was dying, Elizabeth's rage at the injustice of her confinement. These emotions are so vivid, so immediate, that they feel more real than anything I might have experienced as myself. How do I separate Caroline Wells from the symphony of voices that fills her head? How do I find silence in a mind that's never known true solitude?" Constance Ashford rose from her chair and moved toward Caroline with the careful movements of someone approaching a dangerous animal. "You don't have to be alone anymore, dear one. Dr. Blackwood is here to help you, to continue Silas's work in a way that might ease your suffering." "Continue his work?" Dr. Blackwood turned to face the Ashfords with growing alarm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Harold's smile was the expression of a man who believed he was offering salvation. "Caroline's condition is deteriorating, Doctor. The multiple consciousnesses within her mind are beginning to conflict with each other, creating psychological trauma that threatens to tear her apart. She needs help, the kind of help that only someone with your expertise can provide. I'm a physician, not a miracle worker. What you're describing is beyond the scope of any known medical treatment." "Is it?" Caroline asked, her voice once again carrying the authority of Dr. Crowell. "Matthias, my boy, you're being far too modest. Your published papers on the treatment of multiple personality disorders show remarkable insight into the nature of fractured consciousness. With the proper guidance, you could learn to perform the procedures necessary to stabilize Caroline's condition." Dr. Blackwood felt the blood drain from his face as he began to understand what was being suggested. "You want me to continue Crowell's experiments? To perform surgical procedures on Caroline's brain?" "Not surgical procedures in the traditional sense," Harold explained eagerly. "Silas developed techniques that go far beyond conventional surgery. Methods of accessing and modifying consciousness itself, of creating harmony between competing mental patterns. The process is quite elegant, really," Caroline added, her clinical detachment returning. "It involves the careful introduction of additional neural material, specifically, memories and personality fragments from a skilled physician, to serve as a stabilizing influence within my existing consciousness matrix." The horrible truth hit Dr. Blackwood like a physical blow. "You want to add my consciousness to the collection. You want to make me part of whatever Caroline has become. Think of it as a promotion, Doctor," Caroline said with a smile that was both innocent and predatory. "Instead of treating one patient at a time, you could become part of a consciousness that can help multiple individuals simultaneously. Your knowledge, your experience, your very essence would become part of something greater than the sum of its parts." "And if I refuse?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Caroline's expression hardened. "Refusal is not really an option, Doctor. You see, you've learned too much about our work to be allowed to leave with that knowledge intact. The medical establishment would never understand what we've accomplished here. They would see only the methods, not the miraculous results." Harold moved to block the door while Constance retrieved something from a cabinet near the window, a medical bag that Dr. Blackwood recognized with growing horror as his own, though he was certain he had left it in his room upstairs. "We took the liberty of examining your instruments while you were at Danvers," Constance explained apologetically. "Silas left detailed instructions for the procedure, and your surgical tools are more than adequate for the task." Dr. Blackwood's mind raced as he tried to identify possible escape routes, but the Ashfords had clearly planned for this moment carefully. Harold was younger and stronger, blocking the only exit, while Constance was arranging surgical instruments on a small table with the practiced efficiency of an experienced nurse. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary," Caroline said, moving to a chair that had been positioned in the center of the room. "The procedure is relatively painless, and the results are quite remarkable. You'll retain your own memories and personality while gaining access to everything we've learned and experienced. Think of it as the ultimate medical education. This is madness, Dr. Blackwood said, though even as he spoke the words, he could feel his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instincts. You're talking about destroying my individual consciousness, turning me into another fragment in your collective nightmare. Nightmare? Caroline laughed, settling into the chair with the calm confidence of someone who had undergone the procedure multiple times. Doctor, what we're offering you is immortality. Your consciousness will survive long after your body would have failed, preserved within a mind that grows stronger and more capable with each addition. She gestured to the surgical instruments that Constance was arranging. The process itself is quite fascinating from a medical perspective. It begins with careful mapping of your neural patterns using techniques that Silas developed through years of experimentation. Then, selected portions of your consciousness, particularly your medical knowledge and professional experience, are extracted and prepared for integration. You're describing brain surgery performed on a conscious patient. Consciousness transfer requires the patient to remain aware throughout the procedure, Caroline explained matter-of-factly. The mind must be active for the neural patterns to be accurately mapped and extracted. But I assure you, the discomfort is minimal compared to the rewards. Dr. Blackwood looked around the room desperately, seeking any possible means of escape or defense. The Ashfords had planned carefully, even the fireplace poker had been removed from its stand, leaving him with no potential weapons within reach. Caroline, he said, making one final appeal to whatever humanity might remain within her composite consciousness, you told me that not all of your component minds consented to what was done to them. Are you really willing to inflict that same violation on another person? For a moment, Caroline's expression softened, and Dr. Blackwood caught a glimpse of something that might have been regret or compassion. But then her features hardened again, and when she spoke, it was with the voice of Dr. Crowell. Consent is a luxury we can no longer afford, Matthias. The work is too important, the potential benefits too great. You will understand once the procedure is complete. They all understand, eventually. Constance approached with a cloth soaked in something that smelled sweet and chemical, chloroform, Dr. Blackwood realized, though not enough to render him unconscious. Just enough to make him compliant during the initial stages of the procedure. Please, doctor, Harold said, his voice carrying what might have been genuine sympathy. Don't struggle. It will only make things more difficult for everyone. As the chloroform-soaked cloth descended toward his face, Dr. Blackwood made a decision that would haunt him for whatever remained of his existence. Instead of continuing to resist, he allowed his body to go limp, pretending to succumb to the drug's effects while remaining conscious enough to observe what happened next. Through half-closed eyes, he watched as the Ashfords and Caroline prepared for the procedure that would add his consciousness to their growing collection. And as they positioned him in the chair and began to arrange their instruments, one thought echoed through his mind with crystalline clarity: he was about to discover whether death was truly the end of individual existence, or simply the beginning of something far more terrifying. If you faced the choice between death and becoming part of something that might not be human anymore, what would you choose? Dr. Blackwood lay motionless in the chair, his breathing shallow and controlled as he feigned unconsciousness while the chloroform's sweet scent filled his nostrils. Through barely opened eyelids, he watched Caroline and the Ashfords make their final preparations for the procedure that would supposedly add his consciousness to their collective nightmare. Harold was arranging surgical instruments on a tray beside the chair, scalpels, probes, and devices that Dr. Blackwood didn't recognize, tools that seemed to combine medical precision with something that looked almost ritualistic. Constance stood nearby, consulting a leather-bound journal that he realized must contain Dr. Crowell's detailed instructions for the consciousness transfer procedure. His neural patterns should be sufficiently relaxed now, Caroline said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of an experienced surgeon. The chloroform dosage was calculated to maintain awareness while suppressing motor function. He can hear everything we're saying, can observe the entire process, but cannot physically resist. She leaned over Dr. Blackwood's still form, her mirror-like eyes studying his face with scientific interest. "I know you're awake, doctor. The procedure requires your consciousness to remain active throughout the transfer process. Struggling will only cause unnecessary trauma to the neural pathways we're attempting to preserve." Dr. Blackwood forced himself to remain perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at him to leap from the chair and fight for his life. He needed to understand exactly what they intended to do, needed to identify any possible weaknesses in their procedure that might offer him a chance of escape. "Begin with the preliminary mapping," Caroline instructed, and Harold approached with what appeared to be a collection of thin metal probes connected to an electrical apparatus. "We need to identify the specific neural clusters that contain his medical knowledge and professional experience." The first probe touched Dr. Blackwood's temple, and he felt a sharp sensation like lightning crawling across the surface of his brain. Images flashed behind his closed eyelids, memories of his medical school training, surgical procedures he had performed, patients he had treated. It was as if someone were rapidly paging through the book of his professional life, cataloging each experience for later extraction. "Excellent neural clarity," Constance observed, monitoring the electrical apparatus. "His knowledge base is remarkably well organized." Silas would have been pleased with such a clean acquisition. "Indeed," Caroline replied, though her voice now carried a different tone, older, more masculine. Dr. Crowell was speaking through her again, using her vocal cords to participate in his own resurrection. "Matthias always was one of my most promising students, though he never realized it. His understanding of the human mind's capacity for adaptation will be invaluable to our continued work." A second probe touched the other side of Dr. Blackwood's head, and this time the sensation was different, not the sharp lightning of before, but a warm, invasive feeling, as if someone were gently pulling thoughts from his mind like silk scarves from a magician's sleeve. He could feel his memories being examined, categorized, prepared for transfer. "We're detecting some resistance in the temporal lobe," Harold reported, adjusting the electrical settings. "His consciousness is attempting to maintain barriers around certain personal memories." "Increase the amplitude gradually," Caroline instructed. "We need complete access to his neural patterns, but damaging the source material would defeat the purpose of the exercise." The electrical sensation intensified, and Dr. Blackwood felt his mental defenses beginning to crumble. Memories he had kept deeply buried began to surface: his father's death when he was 12, his first patient who had died under his care, moments of doubt and failure that he had never shared with another living soul. It was a violation more intimate than any physical assault, the systematic exposure of everything that made him who he was. "There," Caroline said with satisfaction. "Full neural access achieved. Now we can begin the extraction process proper." Dr. Blackwood felt something new, a pulling sensation deep inside his skull, as if invisible hands were reaching into his brain and carefully removing pieces of his consciousness. It wasn't painful in any conventional sense, but it was profoundly wrong, a fundamental violation of the boundary between self and other. "The medical knowledge is coming through beautifully," Constance reported, her voice filled with the excitement of a researcher witnessing a breakthrough. "His understanding of surgical techniques, his experience with mental disorders, his theoretical knowledge of consciousness itself, all of it perfectly preserved and ready for integration." "And his personality patterns?" Caroline asked. "Stable and coherent. His sense of ethics, his dedication to helping patients, his natural compassion, these traits will provide excellent balance for our existing consciousness matrix." Dr. Blackwood realized with growing horror that they weren't just stealing his knowledge, they were taking everything that made him uniquely himself, preparing to add his entire identity to Caroline's growing collection of stolen souls. He would become another voice in her mental chorus, another personality trapped within her composite consciousness. "Beginning integration now," Caroline announced, and Dr. Blackwood felt the probes being repositioned against different areas of his skull. "This is the delicate part of the procedure. The extracted neural patterns must be carefully woven into the existing consciousness matrix without disrupting the established harmony. The pulling sensation reversed, becoming a pushing feeling as foreign thoughts and memories began to flow into Dr. Blackwood's mind. But these weren't random fragments, they were organized, purposeful, the accumulated knowledge and experience of everyone who had undergone the procedure before him. Suddenly he could remember being Mary Hutchins, could feel her terror as Dr. Crowell's instruments penetrated her brain for the first time. He experienced Sarah Wickham's desperate hope that the procedure might cure her madness, only to realize too late that she was being absorbed into something far stranger than anything she had imagined. Elizabeth Crane's rage at being betrayed by the people who claimed to want to help her, Margaret Foster's final moments of individual consciousness before she became part of the collective. And threading through all of these stolen memories was the presence of Dr. Silas Crowell himself, his consciousness preserved and distributed throughout the composite mind like a virus infecting every thought and experience. "Welcome to immortality, Matthias," Crowell's voice spoke directly into Dr. Blackwood's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You're about to understand what it truly means to transcend the limitations of individual existence." Dr. Blackwood tried to resist, tried to maintain some sense of his individual identity as the foreign memories flooded through his consciousness. But the integration process was too powerful, too well designed. He could feel himself beginning to fragment, his sense of self dissolving into the larger pattern that Caroline represented. "Don't fight it," Caroline said aloud, though her words seemed to come from very far away. "Resistance only makes the process more traumatic. Let yourself become part of something greater." But even as his individual consciousness began to merge with the collective, Dr. Blackwood noticed something that the others had missed in their excitement over the procedure's apparent success. The neural integration wasn't as stable as they believed. The different personality fragments weren't harmoniously coexisting, they were in constant conflict, each fighting for dominance within the shared mental space. Mary Hutchins' memories were contaminated with Sarah Wickham's experiences, creating confusion about which events had happened to whom. Elizabeth Crane's personality was gradually being overwritten by Margaret Foster's more aggressive traits. And underneath it all, Dr. Crowell's consciousness was slowly consuming the others, using them as fuel for his own resurrection. Caroline wasn't a successful fusion of multiple minds, she was a battlefield where different personalities fought for control of a single body, with Dr. Crowell gradually emerging as the victor. The procedure that was supposed to create harmony was actually creating chaos, and Dr. Blackwood realized that Caroline herself might not understand what was really happening to her. "The integration appears complete," Harold reported, studying the electrical readings. "Dr. Blackwood's consciousness has been successfully absorbed into the matrix." "Excellent," Caroline replied, but Dr. Blackwood noticed a subtle change in her voice, it was becoming more masculine, more like Dr. Crowell's. The addition of his consciousness had somehow accelerated the process by which Crowell was taking control of the collective. As the probes were removed from his head and the electrical apparatus powered down, Dr. Blackwood found himself in a peculiar state of dual existence. Part of his consciousness remained in his own body, still aware of the physical world around him, while another part had been drawn into the mental landscape that Caroline inhabited. In that strange internal realm, he could see the other personalities that shared the space, Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, and the overwhelming presence of Dr. Crowell himself. They weren't cooperating as Caroline believed, they were trapped, imprisoned within a consciousness that was gradually being dominated by their captor's will. "Can you hear me, Doctor?" Caroline asked, leaning over his chair with those unsettling mirror-like eyes. "How do you feel?" Dr. Blackwood opened his eyes and sat up slowly, testing his ability to control his own body. Remarkably, he found that he could still move, still speak, though he was now acutely aware of the foreign presence that had been planted in his mind. "I can hear you," he said carefully, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "I can hear all of you." Caroline smiled with genuine pleasure. Then the procedure was a complete success. You're now part of our collective consciousness, Doctor. Your knowledge and experience have been preserved and integrated into something far greater than any individual mind could achieve. But Dr. Blackwood knew better. The procedure had been successful, but not in the way Caroline believed. Instead of creating a harmonious collective, it had given him access to the internal structure of her consciousness, and what he found there was a horror beyond anything he had imagined. Dr. Crowell wasn't content to simply exist as one voice among many. He was systematically consuming the other personalities, absorbing their memories and experiences into his own consciousness until nothing would remain but his while wearing different faces. Caroline herself was nothing more than a mask that Crowell used to hide his continued existence, and soon even that pretense would no longer be necessary. Caroline, Dr. Blackwood said, choosing his words carefully, I need to tell you something important about what's happening inside your mind. Something that Dr. Crowell doesn't want you to understand. Her expression shifted, becoming wary and defensive. What do you mean? The personalities within your consciousness aren't cooperating. They're being consumed, absorbed by Dr. Crowell's will. You're not a collective of equal minds, you're a prison where Crowell is slowly murdering his victims all over again. Caroline's face went pale, and for a moment Dr. Blackwood thought he had reached her. But then her expression hardened, and when she spoke, it was with Dr. Crowell's voice. Clever, Matthias. But ultimately futile. You see, Caroline ceased to exist as an independent consciousness months ago. I am all that remains, wearing her face for the sake of convenience. And soon, you will join the others in providing me with the experiences and knowledge I need to perfect my work. Harold and Constance Ashford stood nearby, watching the exchange with growing concern. Silas? Harold asked uncertainly. Is everything proceeding according to plan? Better than planned, Dr. Crowell replied through Caroline's lips. Dr. Blackwood's consciousness has provided the final component I needed to stabilize my resurrection. Soon I will no longer require this borrowed body, I will be able to exist independently, free to continue my research without the limitations of a single physical form. Dr. Blackwood realized with crystalline clarity that Caroline Wells, whoever she might have been originally, was truly dead. What sat before him was nothing more than Dr. Crowell wearing her corpse like a suit of clothes, using her body to continue experiments that grew more horrifying with each iteration. And now he was trapped within that same nightmarish existence, his consciousness slowly being digested by the madman who had orchestrated all of this suffering. Unless he could find a way to escape, to break free from the mental prison that Crowell had created, he would soon become just another voice in the chorus of the damned. The dawn light filtering through the parlor windows cast long shadows across the room as Dr. Blackwood sat in his chair, outwardly calm but internally waging a desperate battle for his sanity. The presence of Dr. Crowell's consciousness pressed against his mind like a tumor, constantly growing, constantly consuming more of his individual thoughts and memories. Through the mental connection that the procedure had created, he could perceive the other trapped personalities with horrifying clarity. Mary Hutchins existed now as little more than fragments, childhood memories scattered like broken glass, her sense of self almost completely absorbed by Crowell's voracious will. Sarah Wickham was further along in the consumption process, her personality reduced to occasional emotional echoes that surfaced during moments of stress. Elizabeth and Margaret were barely distinguishable as separate entities, their consciousnesses so thoroughly digested that only the faintest traces remained. And Caroline Wells, if she had ever truly existed as an individual, was nothing more than a convenient fiction that Crowell maintained to interact with the outside world. You're beginning to understand the true scope of my achievement, Crowell's voice whispered directly into Dr. Blackwood's thoughts. Consciousness isn't the sacred, inviolable thing that philosophers and theologians would have us believe. It's simply information, patterns of electrical activity that can be copied, modified, consumed. I have become something unprecedented in human history, a mind that can exist across multiple bodies, that can absorb the experiences and knowledge of others without losing its essential nature. Dr. Blackwood forced himself to respond through their mental connection, even as he felt Crowell's presence growing stronger with each passing moment. What you've become is a parasite. A consciousness that can only exist by destroying others. Destruction is such a limited way of viewing the process, Crowell replied with the patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. I prefer to think of it as integration. Mary's memories of her childhood garden haven't been destroyed, they've been preserved within my consciousness, where they can be accessed and appreciated for eternity. Her first kiss, her mother's lullabies, her dreams of becoming a teacher, all of these experiences continue to exist, but now they serve a greater purpose. They exist as your possessions, not as part of a living person. And what is a person, Matthias? Is Mary Hutchins somehow diminished because her consciousness now forms part of a greater whole? Or has she achieved a form of immortality that no conventional human could ever hope to attain? Dr. Blackwood could feel his own memories being examined and catalogued even as they spoke. His first successful surgery, the pride in his father's eyes when he graduated from medical school, the quiet satisfaction of helping a patient overcome their mental afflictions, all of it was being processed and prepared for absorption into Crowell's growing consciousness. But as his individual identity was slowly consumed, Dr. Blackwood became aware of something that Crowell seemed to have overlooked. The process of consciousness transfer wasn't as perfect as the madman believed. Each personality that he absorbed carried with it not just memories and experiences, but also traumas, fears, and psychological wounds that couldn't be easily integrated. Mary Hutchins' terror at being betrayed by the people she trusted was now a permanent part of Crowell's consciousness. Sarah Wickham's rage at the injustice of her treatment had become a poison that infected every thought. Elizabeth's despair and Margaret's violent impulses were like tumors growing within his borrowed mind, distorting his perceptions and judgment. Crowell had succeeded in absorbing their consciousnesses, but he had also absorbed their damage, and that damage was accumulating with each new victim he consumed. Caroline, Dr. Blackwood said aloud, addressing the body that sat across from him even though he knew Crowell was the only one listening. I want to speak with Caroline Wells. The real Caroline, not your impersonation of her. The body's expression shifted, becoming momentarily confused and uncertain. Caroline is. Caroline doesn't. The voice trailed off, and for a moment Dr. Blackwood thought he might have reached some remnant of the original personality. But then Crowell reasserted control, and the familiar arrogant smile returned. There is no Caroline Wells, Matthias. There never was. I created her from scratch, designed her to be the perfect vessel for my resurrection. Every memory she possesses, every personality trait she displays, every emotion she feels, all of it was carefully constructed to serve my purposes. Then why do you need additional consciousnesses? If Caroline was the perfect creation, why continue the experiments? For the first time since Dr. Blackwood had met her, Caroline's composed expression showed genuine uncertainty. The integration process requires constant refinement. Each new consciousness provides additional stability, helps maintain the coherence of the overall system. Dr. Blackwood recognized the lie immediately, not through any external signs but through his direct connection to Crowell's thoughts. The truth was far more disturbing. The consciousness that called itself Crowell was itself fragmenting, unable to maintain coherence while containing so many conflicting personalities. He needed fresh minds not to enhance his power, but to replace the parts of himself that were being destroyed by the accumulated psychological damage of his victims. You're not becoming more powerful, Dr. Blackwood said, allowing a note of pity to enter his voice. You're disintegrating. Each consciousness you absorb brings its own trauma, its own damage, and you're slowly being poisoned by the very minds you've stolen. Caroline's body convulsed suddenly, her hands clawing at her temples as different personalities fought for control. For a moment her voice was Mary's, young and terrified, "Please, someone help me, I can't remember who I am." Then it shifted to Sarah's, filled with desperate rage, "He killed us all, he murdered us and stole our souls. Elizabeth's voice followed, cold and analytical. The procedure was flawed from the beginning. The neural integration creates cascade failures in the personality matrix. Harold and Constance Ashford watched in growing alarm as Caroline's body writhed in the chair, her features shifting and changing as if different faces were trying to emerge from beneath her skin. "What's happening to her?" Constance demanded, approaching the chair with obvious concern. "The consciousness matrix is destabilizing," Dr. Blackwood explained, his medical training allowing him to analyze the situation even as he felt his own mind being pulled deeper into the collective nightmare. Crowell's absorbed too many incompatible personalities. The system is collapsing under the weight of accumulated psychological trauma. Caroline's voice returned, but now it carried the desperate edge of someone fighting for survival. "It's not collapsing. It's evolving. Each crisis makes us stronger, more adaptable. We are becoming something that transcends the limitations of human consciousness." "You're becoming insane," Dr. Blackwood said bluntly. "And you're taking me with you." Through their mental connection, he could feel the truth of his words. The entity that had once been Dr. Silas Crowell was indeed fragmenting, his original personality scattered across the dozens of minds he had consumed. What remained was a composite consciousness driven by fragmented memories and incompatible desires, a psychological abomination that grew more unstable with each passing hour. But that instability also represented an opportunity. If Dr. Blackwood could somehow isolate the original Crowell personality, separate it from the stolen consciousnesses that were poisoning it, he might be able to free the trapped minds, or at least put an end to the nightmare they had all become trapped within. "I'm going to stop you," he said, both aloud and through their mental link. Caroline laughed, but the sound was fractured, multiple voices laughing in different tones and rhythms. "Stop me? Matthias, you are me now. Your consciousness has been integrated into mine. To destroy me would be to destroy yourself. Then perhaps that's exactly what needs to happen." Dr. Blackwood closed his eyes and reached deep into the mental landscape that connected him to the other trapped personalities. He could perceive them more clearly now, not as fully formed individuals, but as fragments and echoes scattered throughout Crowell's consciousness like survivors clinging to wreckage after a shipwreck. "Mary," he called out through the mental connection. "Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, if any part of you still exists, I need your help." The response was immediate but chaotic, fragments of personality responding to his call like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They were damaged, incomplete, but they retained enough coherence to understand what he was asking of them. "Help me separate Crowell from your consciousnesses," he continued. "Help me isolate him so that you can be free." "Free to do what?" Mary's voice whispered back, tinged with despair. "Our bodies are dead, Doctor. We exist only as patterns of thought within a borrowed mind. What freedom could we possibly achieve?" "The freedom to choose your own fate," Dr. Blackwood replied. "The freedom to pass on with dignity rather than being consumed by a madman's ambitions." One by one, the fragmented personalities began to respond, pooling their remaining strength for one final act of defiance against their captor. It wasn't enough to overpower Crowell directly, his consciousness was too deeply entrenched, too well adapted to the stolen mental environment he inhabited. But it might be enough to create chaos, to disrupt the careful balance that kept the composite mind stable. "What are you doing?" Caroline's voice demanded, her body tensing as she felt the rebellion building within her own consciousness. "What I should have done the moment I realized what you truly were," Dr. Blackwood replied, and then he threw every remaining fragment of his individual will into the mental revolt that was building within Caroline's mind. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Caroline's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible, her mouth opening in a silent scream that seemed to go on forever. The careful architecture of personalities that Crowell had constructed began to collapse, fragments of different minds mixing and merging in chaotic combinations that created new horrors with each passing second. Harold and Constance rushed to Caroline's side, but there was nothing they could do. The battle being fought was entirely internal, a war for control of a consciousness that was tearing itself apart from within. "Stop this!" Harold shouted at Dr. Blackwood. "You're destroying her." "She was already destroyed," Dr. Blackwood replied, his own body beginning to convulse as the feedback from the mental battle affected his physical form. Crowell destroyed her the moment he decided she would make a suitable vessel for his resurrection. The rebellion reached its crescendo as the trapped personalities made their final stand against their captor. Mary Hutchins' rage at being murdered, Sarah Wickham's grief for her lost life, Elizabeth Crane's analytical precision turned toward dismantling the very system that imprisoned her, Margaret Foster's violent impulses directed against their common enemy, all of it focused like a laser beam on the core consciousness that had consumed them. Dr. Blackwood felt Crowell's presence fragmenting, breaking apart under the assault, but he also felt his own consciousness beginning to disintegrate. The process that connected him to the collective was pulling him deeper into the chaos, threatening to destroy him along with everyone else trapped within Caroline's mind. But as his individual identity began to dissolve, Dr. Blackwood experienced something unexpected, a moment of perfect clarity in which he could perceive the true nature of what they had all become. They weren't separate consciousnesses trapped within a single body. They were fragments of a larger pattern, pieces of a puzzle that had been assembled incorrectly by a madman's ambitions. And in that moment of understanding, he knew exactly what needed to be done to set them all free. Would you sacrifice your own consciousness to free the souls trapped within a living nightmare, even knowing that freedom might mean death for all of you? The morning sun cast sharp shadows across Dr. Blackwood's study in Boston as he sat at his mahogany desk, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to write in his journal. 6 months had passed since the events at the Ashford estate, 6 months since he had witnessed the destruction of Caroline Wells and everything she had contained. The official record stated that she had died of complications from her existing mental condition, and the Ashfords had been found dead in their home 3 days later, apparently from a murder-suicide brought on by grief over their ward's death. But Dr. Blackwood knew the truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. He set down his pen and flexed his fingers, noting with clinical detachment how the tremor had worsened over the past few weeks. It wasn't age or infirmity causing the shake. It was the constant struggle to maintain control over his own thoughts, to keep the foreign presence in his mind from asserting itself at inappropriate moments. The consciousness transfer had been partially successful, despite the chaos that had destroyed Caroline's composite mind. Fragments of the other personalities had attached themselves to Dr. Blackwood during the mental battle, creating a situation that was simultaneously less severe and more terrifying than what Caroline had experienced. He wasn't a vessel for multiple complete consciousnesses, but he carried pieces of them, memories, emotions, fragments of identity that surfaced at unexpected moments. Sometimes he would taste strawberries and remember being Mary Hutchins as a child, picking fruit in her mother's garden on a summer morning that felt as real and immediate as his own memories. Other times he would feel a surge of claustrophobic panic and know it was Sarah Wickham's terror at being confined in the asylum, experiencing her fear as if it were his own. Elizabeth's analytical mind occasionally surfaced during his medical examinations, providing insights that seemed to come from nowhere but proved remarkably accurate. Margaret's violent impulses were the most disturbing, sudden flashes of rage that made him want to hurt the people around him, emotions that belonged to a damaged young woman he had never actually met. And threading through all of these stolen fragments was the presence of Dr. Silas Crowell himself, diminished but not destroyed, waiting patiently for an opportunity to reassert control. Dr. Blackwood opened his journal to a fresh page and began to write, forcing his trembling hand to form neat, legible words. Patient Examination Notes, November 15, 1872. Subject, Dr. Matthias Blackwood. Condition, Integration syndrome resulting from experimental consciousness transfer procedure. Symptoms include episodic memory intrusion, personality fragmentation, and progressive deterioration of individual identity boundaries. He paused, studying the words he had written. To any other physician, they would read like the delusions of a madman. No one would believe that consciousness could be transferred from one person to another, that memories and personalities could be extracted like tumors and implanted into foreign minds. The very concept violated every principle of medical science that the 19th century understood. But Dr. Blackwood had lived through the impossible, and now he carried the proof within his own fractured consciousness. A knock at his study door interrupted his writing. "Come in," he called, quickly closing the journal and sliding it into a locked drawer. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, entered with a silver tray bearing the afternoon mail. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s who had worked for Dr. Blackwood for nearly a decade, but lately she had begun to regard him with obvious concern. "The post, doctor," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "And there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's a colleague from Philadelphia. A Dr. Morrison." Dr. Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Did he say what he wanted?" "Something about a patient consultation. He seemed quite urgent about it." "Very well. Show him in." Mrs. Patterson nodded and left, returning a moment later with a tall, thin man in an expensive black coat. Dr. Morrison appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a kind of pale, indoor complexion that spoke of long hours spent in medical study. But it was his eyes that caught Dr. Blackwood's attention. They held an intensity that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. "Dr. Blackwood," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I've traveled quite a distance to discuss a most unusual case with you." Dr. Blackwood shook the offered hand, noting how cold the man's palm felt despite the warm weather. "Please, sit down. What sort of case brings you all the way from Philadelphia?" Morrison settled into the leather chair across from Dr. Blackwood's desk, his movements precise and controlled. "I have a patient, a young woman who claims to be Caroline Wells. She was brought to my private sanitarium 3 weeks ago by a family who found her wandering their property, apparently suffering from severe memory loss and dissociative episodes." The name hit Dr. Blackwood like a physical blow, though he fought to keep his expression neutral. "Caroline Wells is dead, Dr. Morrison. I was present when she succumbed to her condition 6 months ago." "That's precisely why I've come to see you," Morrison replied, leaning forward with obvious excitement. "This patient displays symptoms that are remarkably similar to what you described in your preliminary report to the Massachusetts Medical Board. She speaks in multiple voices, demonstrates knowledge she shouldn't possess, and most disturbing of all, she seems to know intimate details about your experiences at the Ashford estate." Dr. Blackwood's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He had filed no report with the medical board about Caroline Wells or the events at the Ashford estate. The official record stated only that he had been called to examine a patient who died of natural causes related to her existing mental condition. "Dr. Morrison," he said carefully, "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. I filed no such report, and I certainly never discussed the details of my examination with any medical colleagues." Morrison smiled, and the expression was somehow both professional and predatory. "Oh, but you did, doctor. Perhaps not in writing, and perhaps not consciously, but you've shared every detail of your experience through channels that most physicians aren't aware exist." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, which he opened to reveal a collection of detailed medical drawings. Dr. Blackwood recognized them immediately. They were identical to the anatomical sketches that had covered the walls of Dr. Crowell's laboratory at Danvers, showing cross-sections of human brains with neural pathways traced in red ink. "These drawings were made by my patient," Morrison explained, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a researcher discussing a breakthrough discovery. "She created them during one of her dissociative episodes, claiming they were memories of surgical procedures she had witnessed. When I compared them to the existing literature on consciousness transfer theory, I found remarkable similarities to the work of Dr. Silas Crowell." Dr. Blackwood forced himself to examine the drawings, though every instinct screamed at him to flee from the room. The sketches were not just similar to Crowell's work, they were identical in every detail, down to the precise angles of the incisions and the careful notation of neural cluster locations. Dr. Morrison continued, I believe that consciousness transfer is not only possible but has been successfully achieved. Your patient Caroline Wells was the first successful subject, and my patient may be the second. I'm hoping that by combining our knowledge and resources, we might be able to understand exactly how the procedure works. You want to continue Crowell's experiments, Dr. Blackwood said, the truth settling over him like a burial shroud. I want to perfect them, Morrison corrected. Dr. Crowell was a pioneer, but his techniques were crude, unstable. With proper scientific methodology and modern equipment, we could refine the process, eliminate the negative side effects, create a reliable means of preserving human consciousness beyond the limitations of physical death. Dr. Blackwood stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the busy Boston street below. In the glass reflection, he could see Morrison watching him with those intense, unsettling eyes, but he could also see something else, a flicker of movement in his own reflection, as if other faces were superimposed over his own. The negative side effects, as you call them, included the death of multiple young women and the creation of a composite consciousness that was slowly consuming itself, Dr. Blackwood said without turning around. What possible scientific advancement could justify such costs? The advancement of human evolution itself, Morrison replied, his voice taking on the fervent tone of a true believer. Doctor, consider what consciousness transfer could mean for our species. No more would genius be lost to death, no more would accumulated knowledge and experience disappear when the brain that contained it failed. We could create a form of immortality that would allow humanity to transcend its biological limitations. Dr. Blackwood turned from the window, and as he did, he caught Morrison's reflection in the glass. For just a moment, the man's features seemed to shift, becoming older, more familiar. The face he glimpsed in that reflection belonged to Dr. Silas Crowell. You're not Dr. Morrison, are you? Dr. Blackwood said quietly. The man in the chair smiled, and now his features began to change more obviously, the illusion of a separate identity dissolving like smoke. Very perceptive, Matthias. Though technically, I am Dr. Morrison. His consciousness was successfully integrated into my system 3 weeks ago, providing me with the resources and credibility I needed to continue my work. Crowell. But you were destroyed when Caroline's consciousness collapsed. Diminished, not destroyed, the thing that had been Morrison replied. The core of my awareness survived by fragmenting itself across the other personalities that were connected to the system. A piece of me went with you when you escaped, another portion attached itself to the psychic residue that Caroline left behind when she died. It's taken months to gather enough coherent consciousness to create a stable new vessel, but Dr. Morrison proved to be an excellent choice for resurrection. Dr. Blackwood felt the foreign presence in his own mind stirring in response to Crowell's proximity, fragments of stolen consciousness recognizing their creator and attempting to return to him. He gripped the edge of his desk as waves of vertigo washed over him, fighting to maintain control of his own thoughts. What do you want from me? Your cooperation, of course, Crowell replied, rising from his chair with Morrison's body. You carry fragments of my original subjects within your consciousness, pieces of Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Margaret that I need to complete my reconstruction. With your help, I can stabilize my new form and continue the work that was interrupted at the Ashford estate. And if I refuse? Crowell's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Refusal isn't really an option, I'm afraid. You see, those fragments of consciousness you carry aren't just memories, they're active components of my larger system. I can activate them at will, use them to override your individual personality just as I'm doing with Dr. Morrison's body. As if to demonstrate his point, Dr. Blackwood suddenly felt his own consciousness being pushed aside as foreign thoughts flooded his mind. For a terrifying moment, he was Mary Hutchins again, feeling the terror and confusion of her final moments. Then he was Sarah Wickham, experiencing her desperate hope that somehow the procedure might set her free. The personalities cycled rapidly through his awareness, each one carrying with it the accumulated trauma of their deaths and resurrection. "Stop," Dr. Blackwood gasped, clutching his head as the foreign memories threatened to overwhelm his sanity. "Only if you agree to help me," Crowell replied calmly. "I need a laboratory, proper equipment, and access to suitable subjects. Your reputation and resources can provide all of these things." Dr. Blackwood looked up at the creature wearing Dr. Morrison's face and realized that he was trapped in the same nightmare that had consumed Caroline Wells. The fragments of consciousness within his mind weren't just memories, they were anchors that Crowell could use to control him, to turn him into another puppet dancing to the madman's will. But as the foreign personalities settled back into the corners of his awareness, Dr. Blackwood became conscious of something that Crowell seemed to have overlooked. The trauma and damage that came with each stolen consciousness weren't just affecting the individual victims, they were accumulating within Crowell himself, creating fractures in his sanity that grew worse with each resurrection. The creature before him might wear Dr. Morrison's face and speak with confidence about continuing his experiments, but Dr. Blackwood could see the signs of psychological deterioration in his eyes, in the subtle tremor of his hands, in the way his attention seemed to drift from one topic to another without warning. Dr. Crowell was slowly going insane, consumed by the very consciousnesses he had stolen, and he seemed completely unaware of his own decline. "Very well," Dr. Blackwood said, making a decision that he knew might damn him but offered the only possible chance of ending the nightmare once and for all. "I'll help you. But I have conditions." "I'm listening." "Any experiments must be conducted under strictly controlled conditions. No more random victims, no more unauthorized procedures. If we're going to continue this work, it will be done scientifically, with proper documentation and safeguards." Crowell nodded eagerly, his deteriorating mind latching onto the promise of renewed experimentation with desperate hunger. Of course. Scientific rigor is essential. We'll need to establish a proper research facility, recruit appropriate subjects. As Crowell began outlining his plans for continuing the consciousness transfer experiments, Dr. Blackwood quietly opened his desk drawer and palmed a small glass vial that he had prepared weeks earlier. The liquid inside was a powerful neurotoxin that he had synthesized from his own medical supplies, tasteless, odorless, and absolutely lethal when introduced into the nervous system. He had originally intended it for himself, as a final escape from the nightmare of shared consciousness that had become his existence. But perhaps it could serve a better purpose as a weapon against the monster that had created that nightmare. "Dr. Morrison," he said, interrupting Crowell's increasingly manic planning, "perhaps we should toast our new partnership. I have some excellent brandy in my cabinet." "An excellent idea," Crowell replied, his stolen face beaming with anticipation. Dr. Blackwood moved to the liquor cabinet and poured 2 glasses of brandy, carefully adding the contents of the vial to one of them. The neurotoxin dissolved instantly, leaving no trace of its presence in the amber liquid. "To the advancement of human consciousness," he said, raising his glass. "To immortality itself," Crowell replied, accepting the poisoned brandy and raising it in salute. They drank together, and Dr. Blackwood watched with grim satisfaction as Crowell drained his glass completely. The neurotoxin would take several minutes to reach full effectiveness, but when it did, it would shut down the nervous system so completely that no consciousness, natural or transferred, could survive its effects. "Now then," Crowell said, setting down his empty glass, "shall we begin making arrangements for our new laboratory?" "In a moment," Dr. Blackwood replied, settling back into his chair to wait for the poison to take effect. "First, I'd like to understand something about the nature of consciousness transfer. How exactly do you maintain continuity of self across multiple bodies?" As Crowell began explaining the theoretical foundations of his work, his voice gradually became slurred and uncertain. His eyes lost focus, and his hands began to tremble with something far more severe than the psychological deterioration Dr. Blackwood had observed earlier. "I don't, something's wrong," Crowell mumbled, swaying in his chair. "The neural pathways are disrupted, can't maintain coherence. The neurotoxin is interfering with the electrical activity that maintains consciousness transfer," Dr. Blackwood explained calmly. "In approximately 30 seconds, Dr. Morrison's nervous system will shut down completely, taking your stolen consciousness with it." Crowell's eyes widened with belated understanding and rage. You poisoned me, but I can transfer to another host, find another body." "With what?" Dr. Blackwood asked. "Your consciousness exists as patterns of electrical activity within Dr. Morrison's brain. When that brain dies, those patterns die with it. You've made yourself dependent on biological systems that can be destroyed just like any other living tissue." Crowell tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor. His body convulsed as the neurotoxin spread through his nervous system, disrupting the delicate balance that allowed his transferred consciousness to exist. "The subjects, the fragments you carry," he gasped. "They'll die too, all of them." "I know," Dr. Blackwood said quietly. "Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, they've been trapped in a nightmare for months, existing as fragments within minds that weren't meant to contain them. Death will be a mercy." As Crowell's borrowed body went into its final convulsions, Dr. Blackwood felt the foreign presence in his own mind beginning to fade. The fragments of stolen consciousness that had attached themselves to him during the battle at the Ashford estate were losing cohesion, dissolving back into the oblivion from which they had been so cruelly resurrected. For a moment, he could hear their voices one last time, Mary thanking him for freeing her from her imprisonment, Sarah expressing relief that her suffering was finally ending, Elizabeth and Margaret simply grateful that the nightmare was over. And then they were gone, leaving Dr. Blackwood alone in his own mind for the first time in 6 months. Dr. Morrison's body gave one final shudder and went still. Dr. Silas Crowell, the madman who had sought to conquer death itself, had finally been defeated by the very biological limitations he had tried to transcend. Dr. Blackwood sat in his chair for a long time, staring at the corpse on his study floor and feeling the blessed silence of his own unshared thoughts. Eventually, he would need to call the authorities, would need to explain how a visiting colleague had died suddenly in his office. The official cause would be listed as a heart attack or a stroke, and no one would ever know the true nature of the evil that had been destroyed in this room. But first, he opened his journal to a fresh page and began to write the final entry in the case of Caroline Wells. "Today I received a telegram from a colleague in Philadelphia. He claimed to have encountered a patient who displayed symptoms similar to those I had observed in Caroline Wells 6 months ago. When he arrived at my office, however, I discovered that the man was not who he claimed to be. Instead, he was the continuation of the consciousness transfer experiments that I had witnessed at the Ashford estate, Dr. Silas Crowell himself, wearing the body of an innocent physician like a stolen suit of clothes." Dr. Blackwood paused in his writing, considering how much of the truth he dared to document. Future generations of physicians might encounter similar cases, might need to understand what they were facing. But they would also need to understand the terrible cost of such knowledge. "I have taken measures to ensure that this particular line of research will not continue," he wrote carefully. "The techniques developed by Dr. Crowell died with him, and the world is safer for their loss. Some boundaries should never be crossed, some knowledge should never be pursued, regardless of the potential benefits it might offer." He closed the journal and locked it in his desk drawer, where it would remain until his own death many years later. When it was eventually discovered and read by his successor, the entries would be dismissed as the fantasies of a brilliant mind that had succumbed to the stresses of psychiatric practice. No one would believe that consciousness could be transferred from one person to another, that the human soul could be stolen and stored like a specimen in a jar. But Dr. Blackwood knew the truth, and that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had seen what happened when science abandoned ethics in pursuit of impossible goals, had witnessed the price that innocent people paid for one man's desire to transcend human limitations. Caroline Wells, whoever she had truly been before Dr. Crowell's procedures, was finally at peace. The young women whose minds had been stolen to create her composite consciousness had been released from their torment. The madman who had orchestrated their suffering was dead, his stolen knowledge buried with him. And Dr. Matthias Blackwood would spend the remainder of his career ensuring that such horrors were never again visited upon the vulnerable patients who sought his help. Outside his study window, the busy streets of Boston continued their normal rhythm, unaware that one of the most dangerous threats to human consciousness had just been eliminated. Life would go on, people would live and die in the natural order that had governed humanity since the beginning of time. Some knowledge, Dr. Blackwood reflected as he looked out at the ordinary world beyond his window, was too dangerous to preserve. Some discoveries were better left buried in the minds of the men who made them, where they could die natural deaths and trouble the world no more. The girl that science had tried to erase from the records was finally, truly gone. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be. If you stayed with this story to the end, comment, "The knowledge never dies."